Judge Thomas Reynolds sat behind the oak bench, his gavel resting within reach. The courtroom, a typical small-town affair, felt almost familiar to him by now. Same creaking wood, same rows of weary faces. He had been a judge in this town for nearly 2 decades, and his reputation was built on fairness, efficiency, and an unwavering commitment to the law. But as he glanced over the paperwork for his next case, his eyes briefly caught a name: Delilah Carter. Delilah stepped up to the defendant's table, and the air seemed to shift. She was tall, with a commanding presence that belied the softness in her eyes. Dressed simply in a dark jacket and trousers, her expression was a mask of stoicism. Despite the casual nature of the case, a simple speeding violation, the judge couldn't shake the impression that there was something more to this woman. Still, he shook off the thought, reminding himself that his job was to stick to the facts and not get lost in assumptions. "Miss Carter," Judge Reynolds said as he looked up, his voice stern but neutral, "you've been cited for speeding. Do you have any explanation for why you were driving at such high speeds?" Delilah hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice steady but quiet. "I was rushing to get to the hospital. My mother's very sick. I didn't want to be late." She shifted slightly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The judge felt a flicker of something. Sympathy, perhaps, but quickly shut it down. "That may be unfortunate, but it doesn't change the fact that you broke the law. Speeding is dangerous, and it puts others at risk." Delilah nodded, the smallest shift of her expression showing a trace of exhaustion, though it quickly faded. She had dealt with far greater struggles than this. A simple speeding ticket felt trivial compared to the battles she had faced in her life. But she had learned long ago that the rules of this world were not always fair or just, and there was no point in explaining herself further. Judge Reynolds shuffled the papers in front of him, his gaze focused on the fine. It wasn't a complicated case, but something about Delilah's calm demeanor bothered him. "You'll be fined the full amount," he declared without hesitation, his voice sharp as he wrapped up the proceedings. "Court is adjourned." As Delilah turned to leave, she glanced at the judge once more, her eyes briefly meeting his. There was something there, an unspoken understanding, or maybe a silent acknowledgement of the weight of her life, of her quiet strength. But it didn't matter. She had been dismissed just like so many others before her. And this moment, this courtroom, was just another reminder of how easily people like her were overlooked. She walked out of the courtroom, her footsteps echoing, leaving the judge to focus on the next case. Neither of them knew how much their brief encounter would change everything. The next morning, Emma Scott sat at her desk in the small office of the Daily Gazette. She was a local reporter with a knack for uncovering stories that often went unnoticed. It wasn't a glamorous job, but she had a passion for giving people a voice, especially the ones who were overlooked by the system. She sifted through the usual paperwork, town events, school news, police reports, but something about Delilah Carter's name caught her eye. She recalled seeing it before, in a forgotten corner of a newspaper clipping, tied to a much different story. Emma paused, flipping back through the stack of old articles she had kept for reference. There it was, Delilah Carter, a decorated war veteran. She had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, earning several medals, including a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart for bravery in combat. Emma remembered hearing stories of her during her military service, how Delilah had been part of a unit that had endured unimaginable hardship, how she had carried her fellow soldiers to safety under fire. Yet here she was, standing before the judge for a minor speeding violation. Emma felt a knot tighten in her chest. How had this woman gone unnoticed by the judge, by the town? Curious, Emma began digging deeper. She called up veteran support organizations, spoke to a few people who had served alongside Delilah, and soon pieced together a story of resilience. Delilah had come back from the front lines with scars that weren't just visible but deeply buried in her soul. The trauma of war, the struggle to reintegrate into civilian life, and the overwhelming weight of being a woman of color in a world that seemed to constantly dismiss her. Yet she had endured. Emma could hardly believe it. How could someone with such an extraordinary past be treated so carelessly? By midday, Emma had written up her findings and sent a preliminary pitch to her editor. But she knew this wasn't just another article. It was something much more. Delilah's story needed to be told, not just to inform the public, but to show them how easily a hero could slip through the cracks. Emma was determined to make sure that didn't happen. Later that afternoon, Emma went to the courthouse, hoping to speak with Delilah. She was determined to find out more, to understand why a woman who had sacrificed so much was now facing something as trivial as a traffic fine. When Delilah stepped out of the courthouse, Emma approached her cautiously, not wanting to intrude but feeling a sense of urgency. "Excuse me, Delilah," Emma called gently. "I'm Emma Scott, a reporter for the Daily Gazette. I've been looking into your story, and I think it's important for people to hear it." Delilah turned to face her, her expression unreadable. There was a long pause, and for a moment, Emma thought she might walk away. But then Delilah spoke softly, her voice quiet but firm. "What do you want to know?" she asked, and just like that, the story began to unfold. Delilah's story unraveled slowly, like peeling back layers of a life no one had taken the time to understand. Over the next few days, Emma spent every moment she could with Delilah, listening to fragments of her past. Each story she told felt like a small bombshell, revealing just how much this quiet woman had endured. Delilah spoke little about her time in Iraq and Afghanistan, but Emma could hear the weight in her words. The nights spent in the desert, the screams of soldiers falling beside her, the constant fear that never quite left. She was a part of a specialized unit, one that carried out missions in the most dangerous territories, often behind enemy lines. It was a job that demanded bravery beyond measure, and Delilah had proven herself time and time again. She had pulled her comrades out of danger during ambushes, carried the wounded miles to safety, and faced death in ways that no one should have to. What struck Emma most was the way Delilah described her return home. The transition to civilian life was harder than any mission she'd completed. She had been given medals, recognition, and honor, but it hadn't been enough. The military had left her with scars that were invisible to most post-traumatic stress disorder, sleepless nights, and the sense that she no longer belonged in the world she came back to. She spoke of how people avoided looking at her, as though she was a reminder of the horrors they didn't want to face. She had tried to find a sense of purpose in everyday life, but it wasn't easy. And so, she had kept pushing forward, doing what she could to get by, often working multiple jobs to make ends meet. But now, here she was, standing in front of a judge over a speeding ticket, a violation of the law that seemed so insignificant compared to the battles she had fought. Emma could see the hurt in Delilah's eyes when she spoke about the fine, how it felt like yet another way the world had forgotten her. It wasn't the money. It was the principle. A decorated war veteran being fined as if she were just another ordinary person breaking the rules. Delilah hadn't been asking for sympathy. She was just telling her story, and Emma was beginning to understand just how much it needed to be heard. But as the pieces came together, Emma realized that telling Delilah's story wasn't going to be as simple as she had hoped. The town was already divided. Judge Reynolds' decision to find Delilah had drawn more attention than he could have anticipated. There were whispers in the community, and already people were questioning the fairness of the ruling. Could the town and its leader really ignore the depth of Delilah's history? Emma knew this was more than just an article. It was a call to action. The story of Delilah Carter spread like wildfire through the town. The article Emma wrote, detailing Delilah's military service, her heroic actions under fire, and the challenges she had faced coming back to civilian life, struck a chord with many. The quiet woman who had been dismissed by Judge Reynolds was now seen as something more, a symbol of overlooked sacrifice. Her medals, her bravery, and the invisible wounds she carried were suddenly all anyone could talk about. Local veteran groups rallied in her defense, and soon social media was ablaze with the hashtag #JusticeForDelilah. But not everyone was convinced. There were those who still saw the case as simple and straightforward. Delilah had broken the law, and the judge had done his job. Why should her past matter now? Some questioned whether the public outrage was an overreaction to something so minor. Judge Reynolds, too, was finding himself at the center of an unexpected storm. His decision had drawn attention, but not the kind he was used to. The media, the protests, the calls for accountability, they were all things he had never had to deal with before. But as the days passed, the weight of Delilah's story began to settle heavily on his conscience. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about the things she had shared during their brief meeting. He had always prided himself on being fair, on following the law without emotion. But now, faced with the knowledge of who Delilah really was, he began to question whether he had been truly fair. His gut told him that the fine was more than just about a traffic violation. It was about something deeper. His own biases, the assumptions he had made because of Delilah's quiet demeanor, her race, and the assumption that her background didn't matter. The guilt gnawed at him. He had judged her based on a moment, one that now felt entirely inadequate to define the woman she was. His role as a judge, he realized, wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about seeing the humanity behind every case, understanding the full context before making a decision. Delilah's background, her struggles, her heroism, he had ignored all of it in favor of a quick judgment. It wasn't long before Judge Reynolds made a decision. He reached out to Delilah, requesting a private meeting. He knew he owed her an apology, one that went beyond words. As uncomfortable as it made him, he needed to confront his own mistakes. He couldn't undo the fine, but he could do something more. Delilah, though skeptical, agreed to meet him. She had heard the whispers, seen the public outcry, but an apology from the judge seemed almost too simple, too easy. Would his words make any difference? Or was this just another instance of someone offering a half-hearted attempt to make things right? When they sat face to face in his office, there was no crowd, no cameras. It was just the two of them. And for the first time, Judge Reynolds saw Delilah not as a case or a statistic, but as a person, a woman who had endured far more than he had ever understood. The meeting between Judge Reynolds and Delilah Carter was not one he could easily forget. As they sat in his office, the silence between them felt heavy, charged with the weight of everything that had gone unsaid. Delilah's gaze was steady, but her posture suggested a quiet weariness. She had lived a lifetime of hardship, and now, here she was, facing another judgment. A judgment that wasn't about the law, but about who she was and the life she had led. "I owe you an apology, Delilah," Judge Reynolds said, his voice unsteady. "I've been thinking about our case, about what I did, and I can't help but feel I failed you." Delilah didn't respond immediately. She had heard apologies before, from people who had no real understanding of the pain they were apologizing for. She had learned to accept them with a quiet nod, but it didn't change the fact that they were often hollow words. Yet, something in the judge's eyes made her pause. There was no defensiveness, no attempt to justify his actions, only the rawness of regret. "I treated you like a number, Delilah," he continued. "I didn't take the time to see who you really were. I didn't see the woman who served her country, who sacrificed more than most could ever imagine. I didn't see you." Delilah's expression softened, but only slightly. She had spent years learning to guard her emotions, to protect herself from the disappointment that often followed moments like this. But there was something different about this apology. It felt sincere, as if Judge Reynolds was finally beginning to understand just how much of his decision had been shaped by biases he hadn't even realized he had. His admission wasn't just a recognition of the injustice she had faced. It was a moment of reckoning for him as well. She folded her hands on her lap and leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. "You made a mistake, Judge, but it wasn't just about the fine. It was about how easily you dismissed me, how quickly you judged me without knowing anything about my past, my struggles, my service. You saw me as just another person breaking the law, and that hurt more than any fine ever could." The words hung in the air, heavy and real. Judge Reynolds sat quietly for a moment, allowing her words to sink in. There was no denying the truth of what she said. His job was to make decisions, yes, but it was also his duty to understand the human beings standing before him. Delilah had been more than a speeding ticket. She had been a woman with a lifetime of experiences that deserved recognition. "I don't expect you to forgive me," the judge said finally, his voice quieter now. "But I do want to make this right. I want to do more than apologize." Delilah looked at him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "I appreciate that, but actions speak louder than words." That was all she said, but it was enough. Judge Reynolds understood. His work wasn't done yet. He had a long road ahead of him, and making things right would take more than just an apology. It would take real change. Judge Reynolds spent the next few days in deep reflection. The conversation with Delilah had shaken him more than he cared to admit. His usual confidence had been replaced by a gnawing doubt. He had spent years enforcing laws with unwavering conviction, but now, for the first time, he questioned whether he had been truly fair. He had dismissed Delilah in a single moment, without taking the time to understand her background or the way of her past, and that mistake was now weighing heavily on him. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that his actions weren't just about the fine. The issue was much deeper, rooted in assumptions, biases, and a lack of empathy. He had assumed that Delilah, a woman he didn't know, was just another person who had made a mistake. But she wasn't just anything. She was a decorated war veteran, someone who had sacrificed more than most could ever imagine. In that moment, Judge Reynolds realized that his job wasn't simply about enforcing the law. It was about understanding the people who came before him, and he had failed to do that. His guilt festered. The more he researched Delilah's military service, the more he understood how extraordinary she truly was. The sacrifices she had made for her country, the lives she had saved in combat, the wounds, both physical and emotional, that she carried. It was clear that she wasn't just another face in his courtroom. She deserved far more than a fine. She deserved respect. Finally, after days of wrestling with his conscience, Judge Reynolds made the decision to reach out to Delilah again. He knew he couldn't change what had happened, but he wanted to show her that he understood now. He wanted to prove that his apology wasn't just words. It was a commitment to change. He called Delilah's phone, his hand trembling as he dialed the number. When she answered, there was no hesitation in his voice. "Delilah," he began, his tone sincere. "I've thought about everything you said, and I want to apologize again. But I need to do more than that. I want to show you that I understand the weight of your service, the sacrifices you've made, and I want to make this right." Delilah was silent for a moment, but then she spoke, her voice measured but not unkind. "What do you want from me, Judge? I've heard a lot of words already." "I understand," he replied, "but I want to offer something concrete. I want to publicly acknowledge the mistake I made. I want to ensure that the town understands who you are, what you've done, and why you deserve more than what I gave you that day." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Delilah spoke. "All right, but don't think it's going to be easy. It never is." Judge Reynolds smiled faintly, knowing she was right. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start, a first step toward redemption. Judge Reynolds' decision to publicly address his mistake came swiftly, but the road to redemption was far from simple. He knew that the people in his town would not easily forget the incident, but he was determined to make amends. With Delilah's reluctant approval, the judge took a bold step. At the next town council meeting, he requested to speak, intending to address the community and set the record straight. When the evening arrived, the room was packed. Word of the judge's apology had spread, and people had come from all corners of town, some curious, others skeptical, and a few hopeful that the judge's actions would show that real change was possible. Delilah was there too, sitting in the back, her eyes hard to read as she quietly observed. As Judge Reynolds stepped up to the podium, the room fell into an expectant silence. He cleared his throat, the weight of his words pressing on him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, but tinged with the humility he rarely showed in public. "I stand before you today to admit that I failed in my duties, not as a judge, but as a human being. I made a mistake in how I treated Miss Delilah Carter. I reduced her to a case number, a violation. But in doing so, I overlooked the woman who had sacrificed for this country, the woman who wore a uniform and served under conditions most of us cannot even fathom." The crowd shifted uneasily, and Judge Reynolds could see some faces softening, while others remained tense, unsure of where this was going. But he pressed on, his resolve firm. "Delilah Carter is not just a citizen of this town. She is a hero, a decorated war veteran who has fought for our freedom, endured unimaginable hardship, and continues to fight silent battles every day. I should have taken the time to understand that before passing judgment. I should have recognized the depth of her service and what it means to live with the invisible wounds of war." There was a murmur in the room, some people nodding, others still uncertain. But the judge wasn't finished. "I ask for your forgiveness, not just for myself, but for the way our community has failed to honor those like Delilah who have sacrificed so much. We must do better. I will do better. And I promise that moving forward, I will take the time to see the people who come before me, to understand their stories, and to make judgments based on empathy, not assumptions." As he finished, a heavy silence followed. Then, slowly, a few people began to clap. It started quietly but grew louder as more joined in, some standing to show their support. The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was sincere. Judge Reynolds looked toward Delilah, who was still seated at the back of the room. Her expression remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something. Maybe approval, maybe a hard-won sense of relief. As the meeting concluded, Delilah made her way to the front. She didn't speak to the judge immediately, but when their eyes met, there was no hostility, no resentment, just a quiet understanding. "You've taken the first step, Judge," she said softly. "Now it's time to show that you mean it." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, her back straight, her head held high. The days following the town hall meeting were filled with mixed reactions. While some residents appreciated Judge Reynolds' public apology, others remained critical, wondering if his change of heart was merely a response to public pressure rather than genuine reflection. But for Delilah, the most important shift wasn't in the opinions of the community, it was in herself. She had been fighting battles for so long, both on foreign soil and here at home, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen. It was rare for someone to acknowledge her struggles, let alone apologize for overlooking them. But something had changed in her as well. Judge Reynolds' willingness to confront his mistake, to admit he had failed her and the other veterans like her, had planted a seed of cautious hope. She still didn't trust easily, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to entertain the possibility that people could change. In the weeks that followed, Judge Reynolds worked to ensure his actions matched his words. He began attending local veteran support meetings, seeking to better understand the needs of those who had served. He arranged a town-wide recognition ceremony for Delilah and other local veterans, an event designed not only to honor their sacrifices, but to remind the community of the often overlooked struggles of those who returned home from war. At first, Delilah wasn't sure if she was ready to be a part of such an event. The spotlight had never felt comfortable, and she wasn't sure she wanted to be put on display for something she never asked for. But as the ceremony drew closer, something shifted. She had seen the genuine effort from Judge Reynolds, and she had heard the support from other veterans. The ceremony was less about her and more about acknowledging a forgotten reality, that veterans were more than their service. They were people with lives, struggles, and stories that deserved to be told. On the day of the ceremony, Delilah stood tall beside Judge Reynolds at the podium. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, but this time, it didn't feel like judgment. It felt like respect. The audience, many of whom had once only seen her as a face in a speeding ticket report, now saw her for who she truly was, a hero, a survivor, a mother, and a woman who had fought for her country, with a fierce and unwavering spirit. The event ended with applause, and as people began to filter out of the hall, Delilah and Judge Reynolds exchanged a glance. There was no need for more words. The understanding between them was mutual. "I meant what I said, Delilah," Judge Reynolds told her quietly as the crowd dispersed. "I'll keep fighting for change. For all of you." Delilah nodded, her gaze softening. "We'll see, Judge. We'll see." As she walked away, Delilah knew that her journey wasn't over. There was still a long road ahead. But for the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't alone on that road. And that, she realized, was the first step toward healing.